Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel, MR.Creepy N. So today's video is definitely going to creep you out. In this video, we're getting into 4 real stories from people who experienced something deeply wrong during cold, dark winter nights. Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. If you enjoy this kind of content, make sure to like the video and subscribe. Alright, let's get into tonight's stories. My neighbor Donna called me on a Tuesday morning in early December. Her heating pipes had frozen overnight and burst, and she needed to stay at her sister's place in a town about 2 hours away while a plumber sorted out the damage. She asked if I could check in on her house while she was gone. Nothing complicated. Just make sure the thermostat was holding steady, check under the sinks for new leaks, bring in any mail collecting on the porch before it got buried under snow. She handed me her spare key through a crack in the door, thanked me several times, and mentioned her nephew might stop by at some point to grab a few things from the back room. She wasn't sure exactly when. I barely processed that detail. I live in a small town in northern Vermont. In December, the sky goes dark before 5, and once it does, the cold takes on a different weight, heavier, more deliberate. Donna's house sat directly across the street from mine. Same era, same basic layout, but older insulation and floors that creaked low and slow when the temperature really dropped. I told myself I'd check in each evening after work, do a quick walkthrough, and be home in 20 minutes. The first 2 nights were quiet, cold inside, dark, the kind of stillness that settles into a house when no one has moved through it in days. I checked the thermostat, look under the kitchen and bathroom sinks, walk the main rooms. Nothing was ever different. The 3rd night changed that. I got there just after 7. A hard wind had come in off the fields, and the front door, when I finally got it shut behind me, rattled loosely in its frame in a way I hadn't noticed before. The house felt hollow. Not just empty, but like the emptiness had weight to it. I did my usual check. Thermostat holding at 62, no dripping. Basement looked undisturbed. I was already back in the front hallway, coat still on, ready to leave when I stopped. On the kitchen counter there was a mug, sitting upright, centered on the tile, still steaming. I hadn't touched anything in that kitchen. I hadn't made anything. I hadn't even walked to that side of the counter. I stood there and stared at it, waiting for some version of an explanation to arrive. Steam kept rising from the rim in slow curls. I looked around the kitchen. No coat on the hooks by the back door. No second set of boot prints in the slush I'd tracked in. No sound from anywhere in the house. I called out once, calm, even, and got nothing back. I left, locked the door behind me, walked home across the street through the snow, and spent the rest of the night telling myself it was the nephew. He had a key somehow. He'd come and gone while I wasn't there. He drank fast and left quickly. I made that explanation fill as much space as possible. The 4th night I almost didn't go. I sat on my couch after dinner and stared at the window across the street for a long time. Eventually, I put on my boots. Everything looked normal until I reached the back bedroom. The door was open. I had left it closed. The closet was ajar. One of Donna's heavy winter coats had been removed from its hanger and laid flat across the bed, arms extended, like someone had placed it there with care. On top of it sat a single wool glove, dark green, belonging to a pair I'd seen her wear in November. Just one glove, the other was nowhere I could see. I didn't touch anything. I backed out of the room, pulled the door shut, and left the house without finishing the rest of my check. I texted Donna from the porch. No response. Called her, straight to voicemail. I barely slept. The 5th night, snow had been falling since noon. By 8 o'clock the street was completely muffled, the kind of quiet that makes your own breathing feel loud. I was in my kitchen making tea when I noticed the light. Donna's back porch light was on. That fixture had been dead for months. She'd mentioned it herself back in October, said the wiring was old and she hadn't gotten around to fixing it, but it was glowing now, soft and yellow through the falling snow, and it had definitely not been on the night before. I watched it for several minutes, then I put on my coat. Her back door was unlocked. I stepped into the kitchen and called out once. Silence. The house was dark, except for that pale glow through the window and a thin band of light from the hallway. There was a smell I hadn't noticed before, something damp and stale, like wet wood that had been closed in for too long. I went down the hallway. The back bedroom light was on. The coat was gone from the bed. The room had been straightened, not cleaned, but arranged, like someone had moved through it with purpose. What was on the nightstand stopped me. Donna's spare house key. The one she'd given me was in my coat pocket. This was a second one. Same style, same worn keychain, sitting in the center of the nightstand like it had been placed there for me to find. I was still looking at it when I heard the basement door open behind me. Not slam, not bang, just a slow, deliberate creak as it swung wide. I didn't wait. I ran down the hallway and out the back door and across the street through the snow, and I didn't look behind me once. I locked my front door, my back door, every window. I sat on the kitchen floor with my phone and kept trying Donna's number until my hands were steady enough to hold it properly. The next morning there was something on my front porch, a clear plastic bag, sitting centered on the welcome mat. Inside it was Donna's wool glove, the missing one from the pair, and a folded note card. Written on it in handwriting I didn't recognize were 5 words. I found what she dropped. I called Donna's sister that morning. She told me Donna didn't have a nephew. I gave the key back through the mail slot 2 days later and never set foot in that house again. I still don't know who was in there. I still don't know what they wanted or how long they'd been watching. I lock my own doors twice every night now, and some nights that still doesn't feel like enough. I want to be clear about something before I tell this. I'm not someone who scares easily. I spent 11 years working overnight shifts at a distribution warehouse in rural Wisconsin, and if you've ever driven those back roads at 2 in the morning in January, through flat, empty farmland where the wind crosses open fields and hits your car sideways, you understand that you build a tolerance for the kind of dark and cold that makes other people nervous. I stopped flinching at shadows a long time ago. What happened at that cabin shook something loose in me that has never settled back into place. It was the second week of February. I'd taken a few days off after a rough stretch at work. Nothing dramatic, just the kind of slow accumulation of long shifts and poor sleep that eventually demands attention. A co-worker mentioned he owned a small cabin about 90 minutes north, deep in a stretch of state forest outside a town called Mercer. He'd used it for deer season, but hadn't been up since October. He offered it to me for a long weekend. No charge. Just asked me to make sure the wood stove was damped properly when I left. I drove up on a Thursday afternoon. The roads were clear until the last 12 miles, which were narrow and unplowed and forced me down to a crawl through packed snow between tall walls of dark pine. I passed no other vehicles. The few driveways I saw were unplowed, the cabins at the end of them dark. By the time I reached my destination, the sun was already behind the trees. The cabin was small. A main room with a wood stove and a couch, a basic kitchen, a single bedroom off the back. My co-worker had left a note on the table with instructions for the stove and a reminder that the well pump needed 30 seconds to prime. The place smelled like pine and cold ash. It felt like somewhere no one had been in months, which was exactly what I wanted. I got a fire going, heated up a meal, and spent the first evening reading. The silence was total. No traffic. No neighbors, no wind that night, just the pop and tick of the stove and the occasional settling of the roof under the snow load. I slept better than I had in weeks. The second day, I walked the trails behind the cabin for a few hours, came back cold and tired in the good way, and spent the afternoon doing nothing at all. That evening, I noticed the first thing. I had stacked my firewood on the left side of the porch when I arrived. When I went out after dinner to bring in a couple more pieces, the stack had been moved. But I had stacked it flush against the left railing, and now it sat roughly centered on the porch, about 2 feet from where I'd left it. I stood there in the cold, looking at it. I told myself the wind had shifted something. I told myself the porch boards had flexed under the weight and the stack had slid. Both explanations were thin, but I chose one and went back inside. I should have driven home that night. The second thing happened around midnight. I was in bed, not quite asleep, listening to the stove cool down, when I heard something from the main room. Not a crash. Not a voice, just a single soft sound, like a chair leg shifting on a wood floor, the way furniture moves when someone stands up from it. I lay still for a long time. The cabin was silent. I told myself it was the structure settling in the cold. Old buildings do that. I knew that. I stayed in bed, and eventually my breathing slowed and I drifted off. In the morning, I found the front door unlocked. I had locked it. I was certain I had locked it. It was one of those simple thumb-turn deadbolts, and I had turned it while standing in the light of the kitchen. I remembered the click of it. It was unlocked now. The chain was still latched, but the deadbolt was open. I checked every room, every closet, under the bed, behind the shower curtain. Nothing was disturbed, no footprints on the interior floors. The windows were all latched from the inside. I stood in the middle of that main room for a long time, trying to find the angle where this made sense. The chain was latched, so no one had entered from outside, but a deadbolt does not unlock itself from the inside either. I packed my bag. I was going to leave. I had my keys in my hand, and my coat on, and my bag by the door. Then I thought about how it would sound when I told my coworker. I thought about the drive home and those narrow, unplowed roads in the dark. I told myself one more night I would leave first thing in the morning in the daylight. That was the wrong decision. I triple-checked the deadbolt that night. I pushed a kitchen chair under the door handle. I kept the lamp on in the main room and slept with the bedroom door open so I could see the light. Around 3 in the morning I woke up. The lamp was off, not the power. The wood stove's glow still lit the room dimly, just the lamp, switched off at the switch on its base. The chair was still under the door handle. The deadbolt was still turned. I sat up slowly and looked toward the main room. There was a glass of water on the kitchen table, a full glass, filled to near the top, sitting in the center of the table. I had not put it there. I had not used the glass the night before at all. I'd drunk straight from a water bottle I kept by the bed. The glass was from the cabinet above the sink, which I hadn't opened since I arrived. I did not move for a very long time. Then, because I had no other option, I picked up my phone and turned on the flashlight and checked every inch of that cabin again. Every closet, every corner, the crawl space hatch in the bedroom floor, the space behind the wood stove. I found nothing. No one. The door was still chained, the windows still latched. I left before sunrise. I drove those 12 miles of unplowed road in the dark, doing speeds I shouldn't have, and I didn't care at all. I called my coworker from a gas station when I hit the main highway and told him what had happened as plainly as I could. He was quiet for a moment and then said, in a voice that was careful and even, "That's the second time someone said something like that about that place." He didn't explain further. I didn't ask him to. I don't borrow other people's spaces anymore. I don't stay in places where I don't know the full history. And I haven't been able to sleep with a lamp on since that night. Not because the dark feels safer, but because every time I see one switched off in a room, I know I left it on. Something in my chest goes very still and very cold. Some things you can't unfeel. That cabin is one of them. I've told this story exactly 3 times in my life. Once to a police officer. Once to my wife on the night we got engaged, because I felt she deserved to know the kind of things that lived in the back of my mind. And once to a therapist who listened carefully and then said something I've never forgotten, that some experiences don't need to be understood to be survived. I'm still not sure I believe her. This was 15 years ago, late November. 4 of us drove out to a stretch of national forest in the mountains of Western Virginia for a long weekend before the semester ended. Me, my friend Greg, my friend Daniel, and Daniel's girlfriend Kara. We'd done trips like this before. Nothing extreme, just a few nights in the cold with a good fire and no obligations. The kind of trip that feels necessary when you've been inside under fluorescent lights for too long. We set up camp on a Friday afternoon. The temperature dropped fast. Once the sun went behind the ridge, and by the time we'd eaten dinner, it was well below freezing. The kind of cold that makes the air feel thin and the stars look closer than they should. We kept the fire high. We talked until we were tired. It was exactly what we'd come for. The The second day was almost perfect. We hiked a loop trail through the forest, found a frozen creek and followed it for a while, ate lunch on a flat rock overlooking a valley full of bare trees. Kara found a hawk feather and kept it. Greg did most of the talking and kept us all laughing. By the time we got back to camp in the early afternoon, we were tired in the good way. The way that means you've actually used your body. That evening, Greg went to collect firewood. We'd burned through most of what was available close to camp. 2 nights of a large fire in serious cold goes through wood faster than you expect. Greg said he'd walk further into the trees and find a good fallen log to break up. He took the small axe and a headlamp and headed out. We didn't think anything of it. He'd done exactly this the night before. He was gone about 20 minutes. I was reorganizing the cook kit when I heard him calling our names from somewhere in the dark beyond the tree line. Not shouting, not panicked, just calling, the way you call when you need people to come and see something, and you haven't yet decided how you feel about it yourself. We followed his headlamp through the trees. He'd gone further than I expected. A good 200 meters from camp, down a gentle slope into a shallow bowl between 2 ridge lines. It was the kind of depression in the forest floor that holds cold air and stays darker than the surrounding woods, even in daylight. His headlamp was pointed downward when we reached him, and he didn't say anything at first. He just moved the beam slowly across the ground in front of us. The earth in the bowl had been disturbed, not randomly, in long rectangular shapes, each one roughly 6 feet by 2 feet, each one carefully edged, the removed soil piled neatly at one end. They were laid out between the trees in 2 loose rows. I counted 8 of them. The snow that had fallen 2 days earlier had settled into the disturbed patches differently than the surrounding ground, slightly lower, slightly darker, which was the only reason they were visible at all in the dark. In daylight, if the snow had been deeper, we might have walked right through that bowl without seeing anything unusual. Daniel said something very quietly that I won't repeat. Kara had her hand over her mouth. Then Greg said, "Look at the trunks." I moved my headlamp up. Every tree standing directly over one of the disturbed patches had been carved. The carvings were at the same height on every trunk, roughly 5.5 feet from the ground, centered, deliberate. They were faces, not rough or scratched, considered, each one different in its features, different in its proportions, but consistent in 2 things. They were all carved with the same level of skill, and every single one of them had its eyes closed, not peacefully closed. There is a difference between a face at rest and a face that has been closed. These had been closed. The expressions beneath the closed eyes were what made me take a step back. Not anguish, not fear, just a specific blankness that looked like the end of expecting anything. We stood in that bowl for perhaps 2 minutes. Then, without anyone saying it was time to leave, we all turned and walked back up the slope through the dark. We called the park's emergency line from camp. A ranger arrived within the hour, a woman in her 40s who listened to everything we said without interrupting. She followed us back out to the bowl, and when she swept her flashlight across the carvings, she went still in a way that confirmed she had not seen this before. She thanked us for calling, told us to stay available, and said there would be investigators on site before morning. We moved our camp to the opposite end of the park and spent our last night barely sleeping, listening to the wind move through the trees and trying not to think about what was still out there in that bowl in the dark. 4 days after we got home, Daniel received a call from the investigator assigned to the case. Every one of the 8 patches had been fully excavated. Every single one was empty. No remains, no buried objects, nothing. The investigator thanked him for reporting it and said the matter was closed. I've thought about Kara's interpretation many times over the years. She suggested it might have been a kind of ritual. People burying symbolic things, old pain, old versions of themselves. She said she could imagine a quiet group of people doing that in the woods with no intention of harm. The carvings a way of honoring something being laid to rest. I've tried to hold that. I genuinely have, but the faces won't let me. If you are burying something symbolic, you don't carve faces. You don't spend the kind of time those carvings required, careful, skilled, individualized, on something that has no specific person attached to it. Faces belong to people. Those faces had been carved to look like specific people. I am as certain of that as I am of anything. Whether the graves had never been filled, or whether they had been empty before we arrived, I don't know. The ranger's face when she saw the carvings told me she was asking the same question and finding no comfortable answer. I've been back to Virginia 3 times since then. I've never gone near that forest. I still camp occasionally, but I don't volunteer to collect firewood anymore, and when someone else does, I watch the tree line until I can see their light coming back. I tell myself that's a reasonable habit to have. Some nights I almost believe it. I've driven long distances alone my entire adult life. 15 years of sales work across the upper Midwest will do that. You stop noticing the miles, you stop noticing the dark, and you develop a very specific kind of confidence that comes from having handled every ordinary bad situation a rural highway can produce. Flat tires at midnight, black ice, a deer through the windshield once outside of Duluth. You handle it, and you keep moving, and it becomes part of the rhythm. I tell you this because I need you to understand that what unsettled me that night was not the cold, not the isolation, and not the storm. It was him, specifically him, and the way nothing about him followed any pattern I had ever encountered in another human being. It was the 3rd week of January. I was driving back from a 3-day sales conference in Fargo, heading southeast toward home through a stretch of Minnesota that is, even in good conditions, some of the emptiest road in the country. Flat farmland on both sides, the occasional tree break, grain elevators spaced so far apart they feel like landmarks from another era. In a January blizzard with the snow coming sideways off the open fields and the visibility dropping below a quarter mile, that road becomes something else entirely. I had planned to make it home that night. By 9 o'clock, I accepted that wasn't happening. The highways were manageable, but the county roads I needed for the last 40 miles were buried. I decided to find a motel in the next town, which my GPS told me was 38 miles ahead. There was nothing between me and it. That's not an exaggeration. I had driven this route enough times to know that the next 38 miles contained 2 grain elevators, 1 shuttered gas station, and nothing else. I saw the truck at mile marker 11. It was a dark-colored pickup, angled off the right shoulder, with its front end tipped slightly into the drainage ditch. No hazard lights, no interior light, just sitting there with snow accumulating steadily on the hood. And as my headlights swept across the cab, a shape behind the wheel that moved. I slowed down. Every experienced winter driver runs this calculation automatically. If someone is in that vehicle with no heat and no lights in these conditions, the math on how long they have is not good. 38 miles from the nearest town. Temperature outside my car reading -14 with wind chill. I did the math and the math said I couldn't leave. I pulled up alongside and rolled down my window. The cold entered my car like something physical. The driver's door opened. The man who stepped out was tall, whatever 6 feet, and lean in the way that looks like it has more to do with deprivation than with build. He was wearing dark jeans, work boots, and a flannel shirt over a thermal undershirt. No coat, no hat, no gloves. He had been sitting in an unheated vehicle in -14-degree weather, and he was dressed like a man stepping out to check his mailbox in October. He stood in the beam of my headlights and looked at me, not with relief, not with the particular gratitude of someone who has just been pulled back from a genuinely dangerous situation. He looked at me the way you look at something you have been waiting for, calm, certain, like my arrival was not luck, but schedule. I asked if he needed a ride. He nodded once. He didn't speak. I unlocked the passenger door. The smell reached me before he had fully settled into the seat. Not sharp, not chemical, just deeply stale, the way clothes smell when they have been worn for days without removal in spaces that don't get enough air. He pulled the door shut and sat completely still. His hands rested flat on his thighs. He did not reach for the seat belt. He did not angle the heating vent toward himself. He did not do any of the dozen small automatic things a person does when they come in from serious cold into a warm space. He just sat there, staring through the windshield, breathing slow and even. I pulled back onto the road and asked where he was headed. A long pause, long enough that I glanced at him. Then, in a voice that had no expression in it at all, town, no name, no direction, just town. I kept driving. The snow was heavier now and the road required real attention, which I was grateful for. We went about 8 or 9 minutes without either of us speaking. I was beginning to construct a version of events where this was simply a man in shock from the cold, someone whose affect had been flattened by hours of sitting in a freezing cab. When he spoke again, "You make this drive a lot." I felt the question before I understood it. Something in the phrasing, in the specific flatness of his delivery, made the hairs on my forearms rise under my jacket. "Not really," I said. "Just passing through." He nodded. Look back at the windshield. 20 seconds of silence, then quiet stretch of road. I didn't answer that one. My hands had adjusted their grip on the wheel, without any conscious instruction from me. 15 miles passed. The glow of the town's water tower became visible through the snow, faint, bluish white. Maybe 4 miles out, I felt my shoulders begin to drop slightly. Almost there. Drop him at the motel, gas station, anywhere with other people, and light. And this would be over. He leaned forward in his seat. "Here is good." I looked at the road ahead. We were nowhere. Open fields on both sides. No shoulder structure. No intersection. Nothing. The town's glow was visible 4 miles ahead. "There's a gas station just up." His head turned toward me. Not quickly. That was the thing. It turned slowly with a kind of mechanical evenness until he was looking directly at me from 18 inches away in the dark interior of my car. And he said one word. "Here." I pulled over. I kept my eyes forward and my hands on the wheel, and I unlocked the doors without looking at him. I heard him open the door. I heard his boots compress the snow. I felt the cold enter from his side, and then the door pulled shut. I drove. I didn't look in the mirror for the first half mile. When I finally did, the road behind me was empty and white, and there was no shape visible anywhere in either direction. I pulled into the gas station in town 4 minutes later and sat in the car for a long time before I trusted my hands enough to operate the fuel pump. The smell was still in the car, that specific stale closeness that didn't belong there. When I finally got out, I walked around to the passenger side to check the door had latched properly. There was ice on the handle that I reached through without thinking, and that's when I felt it. Something tacky and slightly raised beneath my fingers. I pulled my hand back and looked at it in the gas station's light, dark, reddish-brown, dried. I looked at the door handle, smeared across the grip, and the latch mechanism, partially frozen, with something that I recognized and did not want to recognize. I went inside and stood under the fluorescent lights and told the woman behind the counter that I needed to use the bathroom, and I washed my hands 4 times. I sat in my car until 5 in the morning when the roads were clear enough to drive, and then I drove home without stopping. I didn't report it. I've asked myself many times why, and the honest answer is that I didn't know what I would say. There was no crime I could describe. There was a man on a road with blood on a door handle, and no explanation that I could verify. And the thought of trying to put that into words to a police officer at 5 in the morning felt impossible. What I've never been able to resolve is the cold. -14, no coat, no hat, no gloves. A person doesn't survive hours in those conditions, in a stalled vehicle without consequences. They don't step out of it moving fluidly and steadily. They don't sit in a warm car for 25 miles without shivering, without their fingers stiffening, without any of the involuntary physical responses that cold produces in a human body, regardless of will. He showed none of them. Not one. I've driven that route twice since then. Both times in summer, both times in daylight, both times with my phone charged and my doors locked before I even started the car. Every time I pass mile marker 11, I look at the shoulder on the right side. I don't know what I'm looking for. I don't know what I'd do if I found it. I just know that I look, and that I don't stop anymore. Not for anyone. Not ever. Not on that road. Not in winter. Not in the dark. Some doors you open once and spend a long time afterward wishing you hadn't. That passenger door is mine, and that's all 4 stories for tonight. If any of these kept you up, drop a comment below. I read every single one. Let me know which story hit you the hardest, and if you've had something similar happen to you, share it. You never know who else out there has been on that same empty road at night, wondering what they let in. If you're new here, make sure you subscribe. There's a lot more where this came from. Stay safe out there, and maybe double check your locks tonight. This has been Mr. Creepy, and good night.